Love, exciting and new.
Hello, Hannah Waddingham here. Have you seen the fabulous new Sun Princess? World-class entertainment, exceptional dining, and the greatest pizza ever.
It's a love.
Don't miss our Come Aboard sale with up to 40% off and free room upgrades. Visit princess.com or call your travel advisor to book. Princess Cruises. Terms and restrictions apply. Offer ends 2/28/25. Ships of Bermudan and British Registry.
Welcome back to Fine Tooning with Drew Taylor, your one-stop shop when it comes to animation news and commentary. I'm entertainment writer Jim Hill, and Mr. Taylor, whose writings in the industry you can regularly read over on The Wrap, and whose musings on the Mission Impossible films you can listen to on the Light the Fuse podcast. He and I are recording this week's episode on Sunday, February 16th, which, Drew, puts us just 2 weeks out from the 97th Academy Awards, which will air on ABC 2 weeks from tonight, Sunday, March 2nd. And do I have this right that the voting actually ends, well, the day that this podcast goes live, right? Tuesday, February 18th at 5 in the afternoon?
Is that right? Jeez, I got some stuff I gotta put up, before. That's right.
Okay. All right. No pressure. That said, though, as I understand it, just under 10,000 members of the Academy will be voting in 23 different categories, including Best Animated Feature and Best Animated Short. And I have to say, I've enjoyed some of the campaigns they put together to promote some of the films this year, but I only just in this past week saw the one for Inside Out 2, the Choose Joy.
Oh, yeah, that's a good one.
I thought so, too. I mean, it's not going to win, but it's a great slogan, a nice message. Speaking of the Academy Awards, for a while there, it kind of looked like Flow was going to give The Wild Robot a run for its money, but we talked on last week's show about the Annies, how that Chris Sanders film took home 8 awards, and you, as we were sussing out this week's show, pointed out that Wild Robot took an additional 4 awards home at the Visual Effects Society. Its award,
yes,
held earlier this week, February 11th, at the Beverly Hilton. At this point, it does look like DreamWorks has a lock on this year's award, right?
Yes, although just moments ago, Jim, Wallace Gromit, Vengeance Most Fowl took home the BAFTA. So
yes,
yeah,
okay,
yeah,
and we're going to talk a little bit more about that. And in fact, you had a great piece over on The Wrap in this past week that did a deep dive on Feathers McGraw.
Yes.
Though, again, we were just talking about Flow, and which, by the way, began airing on HBO this past weekend. And I finally gotten around to seeing this thing. And don't get me wrong, Wild Robot is a great, great movie and certainly deserves all of the accolades that have been going its way. But have you've seen Flow at this point, right?
I have. Yeah, I saw it back. I think we gave it the top prize at Animation is Film this past fall, which is where I saw it. Yeah.
Because it is just amazing. I mean, it's one of these things. It's dialogue free, 90 minutes long. Seriously, folks, if you have not seen this yet, make time. It's a genuine piece of cinematic art. Though that said, and I have to ask about an animation film. Did it have you ever seen that episode of Family Guy where Peter's in a movie theater and he's watching, he keeps the movie is starting, but it's all of these elaborately produced pre-credit sequences for different production houses?
Yes.
And the gag there is there's like 6 of them in a row. Whereas when I was watching Flow, Drew, there have to be at least 12, maybe 15 on this thing. Though that said, what's interesting is I noticed that one of them was for Criterion, and you have an interesting bit about a bit of news about Flow and Criterion, right?
Yeah, it was released here by Janus and Sideshow Films, which has an output deal with Criterion, and usually they put them out as these things called Janus Contemporaries, which are not totally a part of the collection, and they're always Blu-rays, but this week they announced that Flow was going to be a part of the actual Criterion collection and was going to get a deluxe 4K treatment of so I'm very excited about that. I'm a big physical media guy, obviously. I love Criterion, so this is just very, very exciting.
Yeah, no. And having seen the film now, we'll definitely be getting a copy of this, again, just to have also for the extras. And again, beyond that, all right, there were far too many pre-opening producer credits, but beyond that, once you get into the actual film, all is forgiven, all is forgotten. It's just a masterful film. And by the way, great sound design. In fact, I have to assume as an owner of a dog, you have to appreciate what they did with the audio and the animation there. And
yes, and also Nova is a big fan of Flow. My wife watched it while I was in Sundance and sent me video of the dog watching the movie.
Oh, that is so cool. That is so cool. But seriously, folks, watch this thing. It'll suck you right in. And speaking of sucking you in, I'm assuming that at this point, if you've listened enough to this week's Fine Tuning, you're not going to bail on this podcast, no matter what Mr. Taylor and I do. So let's take advantage of that quick mention of our sponsor, which is the DVC rental store. And if you're planning your next trip to Walt Disney World, you could save some money by renting DVC points through the DVC rental store. Imagine staying at a deluxe resort for a fraction of the cost. Total game changer. Oh, if you're already own or are thinking of joining the Disney Vacation Club, check out the DVC resale market. They're the leader in the secondary market with over 70,000 satisfied members. Whether you're looking to buy or sell your DVC points, they make the process seamless. Okay, now on to this week's news. As always in this part of the show, Drew and I acknowledge what's been going on at the box office, and not exactly a surprise that Captain America Brave New World came out on top. That said, the trades are predicting, what, 100 million over its opening weekend, which is a wee bit higher than the initial projections, which had like at 90, right?
Yeah. I mean,
okay.
I think what's going to be interesting is seeing what weekend 2 is going to be, because I think this is going to have a catastrophic second weekend, but we will see.
Oof.
We will see.
Oof. Okay. But speaking of number 2, Paddington in Peru was number 2 at the domestic box office with this mostly animated film, or largely animated film, selling $16 million worth of tickets in North America, whereas Dogman, third weekend in domestic release, wasn't all that far behind Paddington 3. This Peter Hastings movie sold $12.5 million worth of tickets in the same territory, which was good enough to claim the number 3 spot.
Dogman also, Jim, I have to say, Dogman will be on digital this Tuesday. So
really?
Yes, if you are the day this episode comes out. So if you are curious about Dogman, and it is excellent, you should check it out on digital to rent or buy. Yeah.
Okay, that's kind of a surprise given how well it's done.
I know.
But okay.
Yeah.
All right. Though, that said, if we're being completely honest about which animated features people are really talking about over the past week when it comes to box office and ticket sales, hands down, that has to be Niza 2, which just this past week, after only being in Chinese theaters for 18 days, has already grossed $1,540 million, which has allowed the sequel to 2019's Niza to officially blow past the $1,450 million that Frozen 2 did worldwide when it was also released to theaters in 2019. But again, important to stress here, took Frozen 2 119 days to earn that box office total. And in fact, it was still out in theaters in March of 2020 when the world effectively shut down because of the pandemic, whereas Niza 2 surpassed Frozen's box office take in just 18 days. And again, most of those tickets were sold in one country, China. Now, worth noting that we have at least 2 theaters up here in New Hampshire right now that are showing this 2-hour and 23-minute long thing, and one's relatively close, so I'm hoping to get out and see it. Drew, have you managed to see it yet?
I haven't seen it. I think this weekend is when it started playing in a lot more North American theaters, so I need to go out and see it. But like you said, 2 hours and 23 minutes is a lot.
It is.
Yeah.
It is.
Yeah.
And I couple of the trades have reviewed it so far, and they largely say the effects are dazzling, but the story, if you're a Westerner, is a little tough to follow. I mean, it's English subtitles on top of the original Mandarin dialogue.
Right.
But on the other hand, up here, I do have the opportunity to check this thing out in digital 3D IMAX if I'm willing to schlep down to Massachusetts, so I might do that later. Okay, getting back to what Drew mentioned just a few moments ago. Yeah, news just broke about Wallace and Gromit, Vengeance Most Fowl, taking home the BAFTA for Best Animated Feature. But we were going to talk about this anyway because Drew just did a wonderful piece for The Wrap about the origin of the villain of this film, which Feathers McGraw from The Wrong Trousers. And what I love about this piece, Drew, is you got Nick Park, and did you also speak to Peter Lloyd, or he's
no, I spoke to Merlin Crossingham, who is the co-director of Vengeance Most Fowl. So yeah, Nick and Merlin, yeah.
All right. Well, they talked about the fact that, of course, Feathers McGraw was actually introduced back in 1993 it was the second Wallace and Gromit thing, the project that followed A Grand Day Out, but The Wrong Trousers is only 29 minutes long. It was originally done for, I want to say, BBC Two. And because it was then shown theatrically, it did go on to win that year's Academy Award for Best Animated Short.
Yeah, I think it was screened as part of the, not Spike and Mike, but maybe it was Spike and Mike. One of those kind of, when you would go and just kind of watch animated shorts for a couple of hours in the theaters. That's how I believe it played. I don't. When did you first see it, Jim? I
want to say that I think you are correct. I think, though, at that point, Spike and Mike were doing both their extreme animation thing as well as a kinder, gentler animation festival, and it may have been showcased there. But either way, it's a wonderful piece. It got recognized. But I love the stories you got out of these guys. In fact, can you talk a little bit about when Nick and Peter were sort of sussing out, when they were looking to do a follow-up to A Grand Day Out, and they were, all right, so what are Wallace and Gromit up to now? And
yeah, I had never heard this story before, but Nick said that he kind of pitched an idea where a bunch of penguins came and stayed with them, and it was Peter Lord, who was the co-founder of Aardman, who said, well, what if you just do one penguin instead, because they knew how long it would take to animate 100 penguins. So, yeah.
What I love about that, and taking into consideration that Vengeance Most Fowl features dozens, if not dozens, of mechanical gnomes. So clearly the idea of a whole bunch of penguins whittled down to one, that they still circled back on that idea.
Yeah.
But at the same time, that was the original conceit of this latest Wallace and Gromit project, to the effect of, okay, so it's a bunch of mechanical gnomes that turn evil, but why do they turn evil? And well, again, can you talk about what Nick said from the article?
Yeah, he said that they needed to find something personal to latch onto, and they happened upon Feathers McGraw, although they said it was challenging in some respects because they didn't have any Feathers McGraw figures left at Aardman that they had been kind of rented out, or they're in, exhibits, and stuff. So they had no idea where they were. So they had to just watch the movie a bunch of times, take screenshots, figure it out. I thought that was very funny.
No, I agree. It's a great little detail about revisiting a character again from '93, 3 decades later. Though that said, another thing that I believe this is your observation, where back in The Wrong Trousers, Feathers is really more of a Hitchcockian villain. But when we get to Vengeance Most Fowl, they significantly stepped up their game, right?
Oh yeah, I mean he's a full-on Bond villain with his with the white seal that he's petting, and
there we go.
The submarine that he gets on. I mean it's just so out of control. The other thing I didn't put this in the article, but they told me was that his eyes are actually the heads of pins. That's how small that figure is. That his eyes are, like a sewing pin. Those are his eyes. That's how the cold dead eyes of Feather McGraw.
Well, no, that's exactly those soulless eyes. Okay,
yes.
They're pins. That's beautiful. It's a great article. Go read the full thing over on the Wrap. And by the way, later on in today's show, we're going to follow up on another story that Drew did for the Wrap recently, where he got to sit in the editing room at Universal while Dean DeBlois worked on the live action version of How to Train Your Dragon. But first, this.
Hey, Fidelity. What's it cost to invest with the Fidelity app?
Start with as little as $1 with no account fees or trade commissions on U.S. stocks and ETFs.
That's music to my ears.
I can only talk.
Investing involves risk, including risk of loss. Zero account fees apply to retail brokerage accounts only. Sell order assessment fee not included. A limited number of ETFs are subject to a transaction-based service fee of $100. See full list at fidelity.com/commissions. Fidelity Brokerage Services, LLC, member NYSE SIPC.
My dad works in B2B marketing. He came by my school for career day and said he was a big ROAS man. Then he told everyone how much he loved calculating his return on ad spend. My friends still laugh at me to this day.
Not everyone gets B2B, but with LinkedIn, you'll be able to reach people who do. Get a $100 credit on your next ad campaign. Go to linkedin.com/results to claim your credit. That's linkedin.com/results. Terms and conditions apply. LinkedIn, the place to be, to be.
This episode is brought to you by Nerds Gummy Clusters, the sweet treat that always elevates the vibe. With a sweet gummy surrounded with tangy, crunchy nerds, every bite of Nerds Gummy Clusters brings you a whole new world of flavor. Whether it's game night, on the way to a concert, or kicking back with your crew, unleash your senses with Nerds Gummy Clusters.
And we're back. Want to remind you folks that Drew and I are recording this week's show on Sunday, February 16th, and this podcast, again, will post on Tuesday, February 18th. So if you split the difference there, a week earlier, so now we're talking Monday, February 10th, that was the 85th anniversary of the release of the very first Tom and Jerry cartoon, Puss Gets the Boot. This, by the way, was directed by William Hanna and Joe Barbera, though Joe is uncredited. He's definitely the co-director of this MGM cartoon. Now, back then, the characters weren't called Tom and Jerry. The cat was Jasper, and the mouse was Jinx. But didn't matter to moviegoers back in February of 1940. They liked what they saw with Puss Gets the Boot. By the way, members of the Academy also must have liked this MGM short, because Puss Gets the Boot got nominated for Best Animated Short that year. Didn't win. That year's Oscar did, however, go to another MGM short, The Milky Way, which, by the way, became the very first non-Disney produced short to take home an Oscar in this category. Anyway, I'm giving you all this pointless information about Tom and Jerry because Warner Brothers Discovery has decided that in honor of Tom and Jerry's 85th anniversary, they were going to get in bed with all of these brands to create new merch honoring these characters. And Drew, if I may take a moment.
Yeah, please. Yes.
Okay. Last year, 2024, would have been the year. Well, 2024 was the year that Warner Brothers decided to trash Coyote versus Acme for tax purposes. But that same year, Drew, was the 75th anniversary of the release of the first Roadrunner cartoon, The Fast and the Furious, directed by Chuck Jones, arrived in theaters September 17th, 1949. And I'm just saying, if Coyote versus Acme had actually been released to theaters last year, I would have happily bought merch associated with that movie. Not to mention stuff that tied in directly with the 75th anniversary of the debut of Wile E. Coyote. Anyway,
that would have been nice, Jim, to get
nice.
That, get that privilege.
Right.
Yeah.
All right, but speaking of Coyote versus Acme, Drew, again, as we're prepping for this week's show, came up with an interesting tidbit tied to that Lilo and Stitch ad that ran during the Super Bowl this last Sunday, and that footage, which showed Stitch running loose on the field at Caesars Superdome, was directed by one Dave Green, the director of Coyote versus Acme.
Yes.
And, well, again, I think it's Mr. Chester who says, sometimes you have to try to be positive. So I guess it's nice to see all of the experience that Mr. Green got directing scenes where live actors interacted with animated characters. He finally got to put that expertise to use on something the public could actually see.
Hopefully it also makes up for, the work that I'm sure was denied him by his movie not coming out, not getting other directing jobs. But he did a great job on that ad. I was happy to see that he did it, and it was cute. It was very, very cute. One of the highlights of the commercials, I thought.
This is true. And speaking of great work, and speaking of Lilo and Stitch, again, over on The Wrap, Drew, back on February 5th, posted this great piece that looked back over the career of Chris Sanders, who, of course, co-directed the original hand-drawn version of Lilo and Stitch with Dean DeBlois. And I have to say, Drew, I've been a fan of Sanders' work for decades, and I love how you pointed out in this article that if you crack those Disney art books of the early 1990s, and it's so funny looking back now, which pieces of concept art or story art were done by Chris Sanders, because they look so different from everything else that are in these books.
Good. They are. Oh my God. And Jim, you'll appreciate that he gave me his Stitch book while I was there. He pulled one out, and so I finally got a copy. Yes.
Oh, well, yes. Okay. He gave you a copy.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
I, on the other hand, underwrote a steak dinner for Stuart Ning when I got my copy, but it's a great book. I mean, it's worth it alone for just the you get the actual 19-page thing that he created to hand out, and I love the variations in the story there, where he had a gang, or the who was it? The councilwoman is not necessarily a nice person.
Yes. He also told me an interesting tidbit about that book, which is, if you'll look, and there's a picture of him in the Florida studio, sort of surrounded by all these images on the ground, and those are actually the images from the deleted airplane sequence that they had to take out after 9/11.
No.
Yeah.
How cool. Speaking of airplanes, and again, I never knew this before, but this has always been in Rescue is Down Under, my favorite scene out of that entire movie is the scene where, after the little boy has been captured by McLeish, and the mouse runs to the Rescue Aid Society outpost, and it's like, send for help, and you watch the message go across the globe, and of course that was boarded by Chris Sanders.
Yeah. One animal tells another animal. That's the sequence that we're talking about. Yeah, good.
It is so good, but I never put it together that was Chris. Also, you were just talking about Chris being in Florida, and I was in and out of that studio a lot in the mid to late 90s. And by then he had sort of set up shop there for Mulan.
Yep.
But, you talk about him working on The Lion King, and particularly the two scenes that effectively for a lot of people made that movie, the I Just Can't Wait to Be King and the Mufasa in the cloud scene. But he what's amazing is those are so central to that movie. And he's only in Florida, for a week at a time, 3 or 4 times?
Yeah, I think 3 times, yeah. So he came up with all that stuff in 3 weeks, Jim. Think about that.
Yeah, and you can't think of that movie without either of those two scenes. On the other hand, again, we're talking about Chris Sanders' story sense, and I think is it Schumacher who talks about how Sanders found the real story for Mulan?
Yes, yeah, we talked about that too when I was with him, but I like that Tom kind of outlined this is what makes Chris so special, which is that, in an original version of the movie, she was going to be betrothed or promised to somebody, and so her going into the army actually was somewhat for a selfish reason because she was running away from this thing in her life. And what he said and what Schumacher loved so much was that he made it a completely selfless act. They took away the husband. They put in the matchmaker scene, which is just such a great scene in that movie. And they made it a completely selfless thing. She wasn't running away from everything. She was fine with what the arrangement was going to be. And it adds so much to the story. And it's something that they did not follow through on in the live action version because there were 100 things that she needed to go do in the army. And she was also a kung fu warrior already. So it was very interesting talking to him about that.
All true.
Yeah.
All true. By the way, a side note, another thing that really makes this article great is Drew got to talk with people like Don Hahn and Tom Schumacher about Chris Sanders' career. And I love how both of them, for example, played a big role. You talk about, what was it? They were trying to get him to be the art director on Lion King, and he really resisted that. In fact, it was Don that gently broke it to him after a while that it wasn't working out. You're not the art director anymore. It's oh, good.
Yes, yeah. Which is if you read the article, that kind of comes back around because when he was fired from American Dog, they said, "Well, what do you think about being an art director?" And he just said, this is it. I'm done.
Yeah. And I'm sorry that I just got an expanded version of Creativity Inc., the Catmull book. And the fact that was what Ed Catmull tried to convince him to do, to stay at Disney and be an art director. It's like, well, okay, just when I couldn't think less of you, more thinking less of you.
What, it wasn't the organization of a mob-like price-fixing scandal, Jim, that made you think less of Catmull?
Well, sometimes you think, we're on the floor. We can't go lower. And there we are. On the other hand, Schumacher, and in fact, you will read about this in the book that Mr. Sanders gave you, but the stories he tells about how Tom Schumacher protected Lilo and Stitch from, how does he put it? The folks across the street?
Yes. And that's the second time I had heard that phrase, the folks across the street, because I had heard that Lasseter was famous for working the other side of the street, meaning the marketing, the consumer products, Disney corporate, all of those folks. So yeah, pretty interesting.
No, absolutely. But at the same time, I have to admit, another thing I love about this article is Sanders actually talking about the original animated Lilo and Stitch, where he describes the film as what? Chitty Chitty Bang Bang, but the car, not the movie. Can you explain there?
Yeah, he loved that it had all of its kind of wild elements intact, and he credits Schumacher with that, and Schumacher was very emotional about this when I talked to him. I mean, he really he kind of empowered Sanders to direct, and he protected that. All of those little idiosyncrasies, they made it through, Jim. Yeah.
They did. But if we move to the next thing he was doing at Disney, American Dog. In fact, what's interesting in your article, you actually get a somewhat contrite Schumacher. I mean, at that point, he'd moved on. He's in charge of Disney Theatrical. He wasn't in a position to protect Sanders anymore. And American Dog kind of took a hit for it.
Yeah.
Though, that said, the thing that I have to say this, the thing in that article that most excited me was you getting him to talk about how the early story reels for American Dog were done to the soundtrack of Steven Spielberg's 1941, and now I have to see them.
Yes.
I've always loved that soundtrack.
Here's the other thing I found out, Jim, that the story reels have been completely lost to the hands of time. That they are no longer, they're nowhere in the Disney archives. They are not. So these are something that are only in the memories of people that saw the reels. Were that, it was John Williams' 1941 score, which is just one of his more underrated scores. But I was like, dying to see what that looked like.
Same thing. Well, okay, here's hoping. Kind of like Feathers McGraw, which, again, I know you inferred, they're in exhibits. Yeah, some of those walked out of the building. Okay?
Yeah, I hope so.
I'm kind of hoping somewhere out there, some of the story reels for American Dog walked out of the building. But anyway, on the heels of that, and again, your Ed Catmull story, but how about being an art director? Chris leaves Disney, winds up over at DreamWorks, where oddly enough, he's assigned to work on Croods, which is at this point, kind of an artifact of an Aardman stop motion film that had problems.
Yes, it was written by John Cleese, the original treatment.
It was.
Yeah.
Okay, but anyway, same thing. Suddenly, there's a troubled movie in the building, How to Train Your Dragon, and Katzenberg asks, can you take it over? And this part of the interview is fascinating. Chris reunites with Dean DeBlois. But again, this is a film that has, I think they were able to move the release date by a couple of months, but not a lot. So they had to get it right. They did. In fact, I think you allude in the article that Katzenberg says something to the effect that here we make movies 3 times and then they get released, and in this situation you only get one shot at it.
Yeah.
And so Chris describes going down into the framework of the movie, getting past the character stuff, getting past the narrative, and essentially deciding what this movie is about.
Yeah.
They had to make a decision about, okay, is this a movie where Vikings ride dragons, or is this a movie where when things start off, Vikings are at war with dragons? And that's the better story, the latter thing. And as you point out, the early version of this, when we got Toothless, we got a cute little 3-foot long dragon, whereas Chris was the one championing that no, this has to be the most dangerous dragon in the world. And in fact, can you describe how they made it the most dangerous dragon?
Yeah, he said it was sort of like building a sports car or a stealth jet.
There we go.
Yeah, where it was something that nobody had ever seen because it was only at night and, it was very low to the ground. And the other thing that's interesting is that was the only character they could actually afford to build, because they were working with all the pre-existing assets from the earlier version of the movie. So that's why it's the only one that looks like a Chris Sanders drawing. It's because the only one that they could afford to look like a Chris Sanders drawing. And not to throw this back to my How to Train Your Dragon interview, but it's really interesting that, we'll get into it in a minute, but there's an interesting comparison between the animated and the live action
I
one.
know the analogy you're about to make, and yes,
we will save it.
That's a great part of that interview. But again, the lesson from the original How to Train Your Dragon Sanders carried away is look at your film at the engineering level before you get into the fun stuff and get distracted. Anyway, long story short, great article, lots of insights into Chris Sanders' other films, including The Wild Robot. So go check that out. And as Drew just teased, in this Chris Sanders piece, there's, of course, a lot of stuff about Dean DeBlois. In fact, I love the tidbit you got in there where Dean had actually done a pass.
I had never heard that before, had you?
I know, same thing.
Yeah.
A Dean DeBlois take on The Wild Robot, and I'd love to read that. But again, like we mentioned earlier in the show, Drew got to sit down with Dean in the editing bay over at Universal, and we're going to talk about that interview, which, by the way, you can read in full over at the Wrap in a moment. But first, this.
Every cup of Nespresso coffee is an invitation to transform your morning routine into a ritual you can treasure each and every day. Using the Virtuo Pup, a simple touch of the button freshly brews bold aromas and a rich, velvety crema layer for delicious cafe-quality coffee at home. Whether you enjoy your coffee hot or over ice, every sip, every morning is unforgettable. Nothing tastes like Nespresso coffee. Visit Nespresso.com or our app to explore our full range of easy-to-use machines and coffees not found anywhere else.
And we're back. I have to tell this story before we get started. And I wanted to actually go back and listen to last week's Fine Tooning to see if we actually mentioned this as part of the show, because I know we talked about it afterwards, that we're wrapping up the recording session, and Drew was actually talking about how he'd already got this go over to Universal and sit with Dean in the editing bay, and he got to see about 20 minutes of the live action version of How to Train Your Dragon. But you also mentioned that you saw the trailer.
Yes.
And this is essentially what Drew told me last week. It's like, this trailer looks so good that if I were Disney, I'd push back the release date of Elio by at least a week, because once people see this trailer, the movie that they're going to want to go see on June 13th isn't Elio. It's going to be How to Train Your Dragon. And so that trailer, was it released Tuesday or Wednesday of last week?
I think it was Wednesday. Yeah.
Okay. So by Friday, suddenly we have a story about how Elio's release date has been pushed back by a week to June 20th. So I just want to give you credit that you called that.
I forgot that we had talked about that, but yes,
that was the thing. On Friday when that story broke, it's like, God damn, Drew called it.
Yeah, I texted somebody at Pixar and I said, how to run away from your dragon. And they said, hey, they do breathe fire, which is true. They're very scary. Yeah. Yeah.
All right. But to be fair here, that is an amazing trailer. You look at that and you can see why Disney blinked.
Yeah.
I want to see that movie today.
Yeah.
Now, again, back to Drew's visit in the editing bay with Dean DeBlois. Lots of great stories. Some of this we just kind of touched on with the Chris Sanders section about how the animated version of How to Train Your Dragon was made in such a rush. There were things that he and Chris wanted to do. The thing I'm fascinated by with this article that you wrote about sitting down with Dean is him talking about, well, we decided to treat the animated movie like the most recent test screening.
Yeah.
Look for ways to improve it.
Yeah, that was interesting.
But at the same time, Dean, in fact, I think we talked about this in earlier editions of Fine Tooning. Dean's not a fan of this animation to live action trend. And the hard reality was Universal was going to make this movie anyway. So why not get involved and make it as good as it could be? But he saw this as an opportunity to revisit the film, right? Or the story, and go deeper with the characters and make the action scenes and the flying scenes that much more visceral.
Yeah. One of the scenes that I saw was the training scene, and it was way more intense than the animated version. And Jim, you'll love this. Kind of offhandedly, I said, well, if you get to do the sequel, follow through on the Cate Blanchett character being a villain. And he said, yeah, I would. So, we might get a do-over of that as well, Jim. So, yeah.
That would be cool. That would be cool.
I said Jeffrey's not around anymore. You can do it. Yeah.
But at the same time, what's interesting is that he also used this as an opportunity to effectively get the band back together, in that he brought John Powell back to handle the music and actually attempted to get Roger Deakins to come back, because he consulted on the original How to Train Your Dragon, right?
I think he has a credit on all three as some photographic consultant or something. But
there we go.
Yeah.
Because, they're composed brilliantly from a visual point of view. But I guess Deakins at this point isn't making these sort of movies anymore. He's working more on the independent side. So he recommended Bill Pope. Is that right?
Yeah. Bill Pope, he's worked with Sam Raimi a bunch of times. He shot The Matrix and a lot of Edgar Wright's movies. So it looks like a good looking movie. Yeah.
All right. Now let's get to the story that you teased on the earlier portion of the show, where here's Dean looking at the live action version of How to Train Your Dragon, and the notion is these dragons have to have weight. They have to have menace. So he actually reaches out to John Dykstra, who obviously worked with ILM and worked on the Jurassic Park dinosaurs. And they were trying to get a handle on how to do Toothless in the live action. Can you talk about John's advice to Dean?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, he said that Dykstra was he works as a consultant at Universal, I guess. And Dykstra is a legendary visual effects guy, created the Dykstra Cam or the Dykstra Flex for ILM, which is how they made the original Star Wars. They wouldn't have been able to do it. And he said that he should think of the live action as coming. The live action movie came first, and then the animated movie came after, and that's why the designs are simpler and they're more pleasing and they're kind of more cartoony, almost like the Saturday morning version of the live action movie, which I thought was so interesting, and I love that it came from Dykstra. It's just so cool.
And but at the same time, to watch that ad and to look what they did with Toothless. The interesting thing is he is the most dangerous dragon, but at the same time, the fact that they're able to make that pivot and that he's charming and that he's sweet and he's a character you're invested in. I can't wait for this movie. And again, it was so nice. What you got Dean to say was so reassuring. It's like, oh, killer.
Yeah.
So many of the, as you mentioned with the live action version of Mulan, it was almost like that movie was made by people who didn't trust the source material.
Yeah.
And if anything, what's nice about the live action version of How to Train Your Dragon is here's a guy who not only trusted the source material, but it's like, we can do better.
Yeah.
And just what you got him to talk about with Astrid, just deepening that character.
Yeah.
Cannot wait for this movie.
It was great. He was, and Dean, he is like the sweetest guy in the world. And was just, I really appreciated him kind of opening up this early too, because the movie is still months away. But everything I saw was just incredible. The scene where he tries to kind of prove to the rest of the Vikings that the dragons are nice is just incredible. And the tension, and the scene I'm talking about, Jim, where where Toothless comes and rescues Hiccup from this kind of big scary dragon that's on fire, and it's just wonderful. It's just absolutely wonderful. I cannot wait to see the rest of it, but it's a real it's a step up in a lot of ways.
Well, again, seriously, folks, shared a lot of good stories here, but if you want the full impact, go over to the Wrap and read this article. And again, by the way, if you're looking for entertaining things from Mr. Taylor, there is, of course, his Light the Fuse, the official Mission Impossible podcast that he does with Charles Hood. And are we still waiting on the return? What's going on?
It's coming. It'll be sooner rather than later, but yeah, I'm very excited about this next batch of episodes. I think everybody will be excited as well. And Jim, what do we have on your side of the fence?
Oh, way too much crud. Okay, we have Disney Dish that I do with Len Testa. We also have the Epic Universal podcast, which I do with Eric Hersey, who produces a lot of the podcasts here. I also have I Want That Too, which is our Disney merch podcast that I do with Eric's lovely bride, Lauren. We just recently posted a brand new Looking at Lucasfilm, which I do with Brian Gahn. And want to remind folks that here at Jim Hill Media, we also host Manufacturing the Magic, which is a themed entertainment history podcast that Noah and Shelley Valladolid do for us. And then, of course, there is Disney Unpacked, our Patreon project that Len and I do with veteran Imagineer Jim Schul. We've just, in fact, should be dropping this coming weekend the next video in that series, which is about Tom Sawyer's Island. And Mr. Schul and I are already hard at work on our next show for Patreon, which will be about It's Tough to Be a Bug. Anyway, bringing things to a close here. Again, thanks to Eric Hersey and David Gray for editing and producing this podcast. Also, folks, if you could do Drew and I a favor, head on over to Apple Podcasts and rate and review not just this show, but also light the fuse. Finally, as we head out the door here, Drew, social media. So Blue Sky or Mammoth?
I'm not on Blue Sky. I know I have a Blue Sky account. I need to just go. I need to go to Blue Sky and Threads or whatever, but I'm still on X and Instagram. As Drew Tailored, like a tailored shirt. And Jim, where can people find you?
I'm on X and Instagram as Jim Hill Media, and over on Facebook as Jim Hill Media News. And yes, I will look into Blue Sky and Threads and Mammoth. All right. Final thing, folks, as we head out the door here. Folks out west still dealing with the after effects of all those wildfires. And if you are in a position to help right now, if you could please make a donation to the American Red Cross, that would be great. All right. Anyway, on behalf of Mr. Taylor, thanks for listening to this week's Fine Tuning, and we will be back soon.